Hey guys, welcome to Intro to Biological Anthropology. My name is Rachel. I'm a PhD student here at Ohio State in the anthropology department, and I'm going to be presenting your lectures and guiding you through this semester. My office hours are going to be Mondays from 3 to 5 p.m., and the Zoom link is available to hop into those in the syllabus and also in the welcome page. Also, you can shoot me an email if that time doesn't work for you, if you have class or work. We can also meet at another time if you have questions about this course, no problem. Also, there's my email if you need to get in touch, but my email is in a few places on the Carmen page. So I'm very accessible and I'm usually pretty quick with email. So if you have any questions, just reach out whenever you need to. So without further ado, let's get started. Some goals for today are to give you a brief overview of what to expect from this course and some details in the syllabus, what books are required, and then after that we'll dive into the lecture itself for this week, which should be pretty straightforward. First, a little bit about me. I received my bachelor's in anthropology at the University of La Verne in Southern California. Then my master's degree is in anatomy at USC. And now here I'm a PhD student and I have the pleasure of teaching courses like this one. And I also assist with the FAST lab, that's F-A-S-T, at Ohio State, which provides forensic anthropology consultation services to local law enforcement. So if you have no idea what anthropology is or what forensic anthropology is, then I'm glad you're here. So a quick overview of this course. You can find all of this information in Carmen. And so basically you have 2 to 3 assignments that are going to be due at the end of every week on Sunday nights. So Sundays, 11:59 p.m., that's when everything's going to be due. So weekly reflections, you have one every week starting this week. You just need to write at least 3 sentences reflecting on the lecture this week. And I'll give you some suggestions on what to write about, or you can just write your own reflection without a prompt. That's totally fine. It just has to be relevant to the lecture somehow. The lowest 2 are dropped. So if there are a couple weeks where you just don't write enough to get full credit, or if you can't turn them in, we drop the lowest 2. Next, labs. So there are weekly labs, not this week, but every other week going forward. They're just basically activities that are based on the content that's covered in class. The lowest 1 is dropped, but those are worth more than the reflections. Those are worth 20% of your grade. And then every other week, there's going to be a quiz. So these are open note, open book quizzes. They're all multiple choice questions, 20 questions each. So there's 7 of those. Those are worth 20% of your grade, and all of your grades for those quizzes are kept. And that's, because they're open note, open book. There is a time limit on them of 60 minutes, but it's only 20 questions. If you have accommodations through the accommodations center, then we can definitely get that worked out for you as well. Then there are 2 exams. There's a midterm and a final exam. Both of those are multiple choice, and they are each worth 25% of your grade. So all of these assignments, quizzes, and exams are going to be due by Sunday at midnight of whatever week that they happen to be due. So as someone who is actively taking classes as well, I'm still a student here, I wanted to just lightly present a perfect scenario schedule for how to navigate asynchronous courses. The times I've taken asynchronous courses, these methods tend to work for me, but you do not have to follow them whatsoever. If you know what works best for you, please by all means do that. But I think this course could possibly be handled either 2 times a week or 1 time a week, depending on your classwork, your class schedule this semester. So if you want to do this 2 times a week, I would recommend dedicating 2 to 3 hours a day, twice a week, of watching the lectures and doing the reflection on one day, and then reviewing the handout, which are just like written versions of the lectures, and do the lab and quiz on a second day. So those two things together each take about 2 to 3 hours, depending on how much content we cover in a week. Or alternatively, there's the one time a week method, to where if there's one day during the week where you don't have any classes, I would recommend making that your intro to bioanth day, where you spend the day watching the lecture, doing the assignments and the quizzes, and that's just what you do that day. That should take about 4 to 6 hours, because essentially you're doing a week's worth of work in a day. But, only do what works for you. If that's too much, I totally understand. Sometimes it's better to break things up into chunks, especially if you're new to anthropology, and a lot of this is going to be new and possibly slightly challenging content for you. So my recommendations about studying for exams in this course: I am a flashcard person. I use a free web application called Anki. So I am providing you guys with Anki flashcards that you can use to study. So when I write these lectures, I always double check the quiz questions and the exam questions to make sure that everything that's on the quizzes and exams are in these lecture materials and in your flashcard decks. So you should have all the information you need to succeed on the exams and on the quizzes. And if you use the flashcards, that could be a great way to prepare for those exams and quizzes as well. I am not an Anki wizard by any means. I use it in a very basic way, but I know that there are a lot of YouTube videos out there if you guys have any trouble like getting set up. And I think it is a fairly popular application for students to use, so you might know someone else who uses it already, and they can help you out as well. So textbooks, there's only one textbook required for this course. That is Introduction to Biological Anthropology, the lab manual. So you don't need the actual textbook. It's recommended, but it's not required. And the reason for that is because I'm putting the content from the textbook, plus any additional relevant information, into these lecture slides. So you don't necessarily need the textbook, because all of the information you need to know and that's important is going to be in these lecture slides, the handouts, and in the flashcards. So you do need the lab manual though, because you are going to be working through specific exercises in that lab manual. So get that. It's available at the bookstore. If you need a hand, ask your fellow students. I personally haven't had to use the bookstore yet, so I don't know how helpful I would be specifically with getting the lab manual. But if you need help, you can reach out to me as a last resort, and I can try and struggle through it with you. Okay, so without further ado, let's start. When I first started undergrad, I had no idea what anthropology was, so I thought we could just start with anthropology. Okay, cool. That sounds interesting, but what does it mean? So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Our lecture objectives are going to be to talk about the 4 fields of anthropology. Then we're going to go over a few things that you probably already learned in biology when you were in high school. So we're going to be talking about the flow of the scientific method. Then I'm going to bring up some major contributors to contemporary scientific thinking, people who contributed to the theory of evolution, basically. And this is a very important slide. I'm just going to throw that out there for when you're studying, because lecture objectives are used to write exams in courses. So your teachers have these lecture objectives and course objectives, and we write our exams and quizzes based off of those to make sure you're meeting those objectives. So when you study for your midterms and finals, write these three things down and see if you can answer them, like without consulting your notes. And if you feel like you can answer these lecture objectives thoroughly without consulting your notes, then you're definitely going to nail the midterm and the final exam. So moving on to what anthropology actually means. So it's from the Greek word combination of anthropos, meaning man or human, and logos, meaning study. So literally the two coming together means the study of man. But in contemporary English, we say it's the study of humanity. It's the study of all aspects of the human experience. So that encompasses studying mankind or humankind and asking ourselves, how did we evolve to become humans? What is human culture? And how does human culture vary across the globe? Also, how do historic, prehistoric, and contemporary human populations vary across the globe? So it's a lot of studying variation. Biological anthropology is specifically interested in this third question: how do historic, prehistoric, and contemporary human populations vary across the globe? And that also includes non-human primates as well. So I just wanted to throw this out here because I will comment on your reflections if you use the word modern when you actually mean contemporary. This is just a little pet peeve of mine. I won't dock you points or anything, but I will comment and say, the word modern actually means the early to mid 20th century. We are not in modern times anymore. So the appropriate word when you're describing today would be contemporary times, which means current times. And that word just kind of always means now. It doesn't have a specific time frame attached to it, whereas modern does. So I hope that helps. Anthropology studies human culture and evolutionary aspects of human biology. So that means variation or differences and similarities among cultures of the world. Variation among past cultures. We have fossils and we have the archaeological record. And we study variation in evolution through the fossil record and see how that variation in the past has led to variation that we see now, which is a pretty wide area of interest. And that makes us very hireable anthropologists. So we often work in museum jobs as curators or outreach. We are also in archaeology jobs a lot. So there's an industry called CRM, or Cultural Resource Management. You can be a contract archaeology job and travel a lot. So if you like to travel and you're interested in history, that could be a good route for you. Of course, we're in academia, right? But journalism, a lot of cultural anthropologists pursue journalism or writing avenues in that sense. Research, like what I do as a PhD student, or also medical legal death investigation if you're more interested in the forensic route. We do have a forensic anthropology major here at OSU, and a lot of those students move on to become medical legal death investigators or join like the law enforcement system. So these career paths also vary depending on the field of anthropology. So this is a very important slide. The 4 fields of anthropology are cultural anthropology, linguistic anthropology, archaeology, and biological anthropology. Biological anthropology being the topic of this course you're taking. So anthropologists take an integrative approach with the 4 fields. So for example, I specialize in biological anthropology because I study forensic anthropology, an applied branch. But forensic anthropology, I have to integrate linguistic anthropology, archaeology, and sociocultural or cultural anthropology into my forensic work because I would do a pretty bad job, and I would have a pretty narrow mind if I was strictly only thinking about like the hard science and forensics. I have to zoom out oftentimes and think about the humanity of what I'm doing, and also use archaeological techniques to recover individuals from scenes as well. So I integrate all of these fields, and anyone else you talk to who specializes in a different field will tell you the same thing and how they integrate other fields into what they do. So cultural anthropology is the study of cultures. They can either compare one culture to another, or they can specifically study one culture and become an expert in that. Oftentimes, it's a culture that this person is native to, but not always. And so cultural anthropology is the study of societies, belief systems, cultural adaptations, anything really related to culture. So, for example, cultural anthropologists exercise their expertise to advocate for vulnerable groups or individuals. So, they have provided expert testimony in court on behalf of Native or vulnerable populations, and they do that to help bridge a gap, to facilitate communication between Western institutions and populations who have a historic distrust in institutions due to structural violence. So they can help represent and bridge that gap to make sure that populations still have their needs met. Linguistic anthropology means the study of language use, which means patterns, structure, and how language has changed over time. So humans use language, right? And we have this idea that language shapes culture, right? So we teach people language. Children and people grow up learning languages, but with the specific words that we learn also kind of shapes how we think. So the vocabulary that we use reflects the environment in which it is spoken. So if you think about specific words that are used in the medical field that we don't actually have to know, but they need to know them in the medical field, the crafting world, the video gaming world, or specific age groups, how certain generations use words or create their own words that they use, and other generations are like, I don't know what that means. Language shapes culture, and that's kind of what linguistic anthropology is all about. Then we have archaeology. This is the study of the patterns of behavior and the material record of humans who lived in the past. So they do this by studying artifacts and human remains. I really like this photo because there's actually a human skull in this photo. So this is the top of a human skull found at an archaeological dig site in, well, this is a construction monitoring site. So people were trying to construct a building, they came across human remains, and so they called in archaeologists. And so they found this human skull, but one thing that I'd like you guys to notice here is these sharp margins here. This skull was actually cut. The reason why the skull was cut is because they were actually excavating where an old medical school used to be. So these are old dissection cadavers from that very first medical school. So that kind of context is important for an archaeologist to know when they're approaching an archaeological excavation. So an archaeologist can either focus on artifacts or they can focus on the human remains and biocultural aspect of that. So if someone is specifically interested in pots or arrowheads or old buildings, then you can just be like a general archaeologist. But if you're specifically interested in anatomy and learning more about the skeleton and studying the bones and the people themselves, then that would be more bioarchaeology. And you can also be a student at a bioarchaeological field school. That's a great way to find out if you think it would be right for you. And if you have any questions about archaeology, or if you might be interested in learning more about attending a field school, then I would recommend reaching out to Dr. Zedglik or Dr. Z. She is an archaeologist. Well, she's a bioarchaeologist here at Ohio State, and she actually runs a field school in Transylvania, Romania, that is doing some really, really interesting work. So if you're interested, there's her email, or you can look her up on the Ohio State website. So finally, what we've all been waiting for, biological anthropology, the fourth field of anthropology. It's the study of biological and biocultural facets of humans and their relatives. So biological anthropologists consider both past and present populations. So take a look at this image. These are a bunch of radius bones. So the radius bone is a bone in your forearm on the side where your thumb is on. And so notice that these are all completely different heights. So this one is really long, this one is pretty short. And notice how their colors are different, right? So in an X-ray, we talk about radio opacity, or like how opaque something is, and that can tell you about someone's bone density a little bit. So because this one is much whiter than, say, this one, this person has much higher bone density than this person. So that could mean this is an older individual, or they just have less dense bone for whatever reason. So biological anthropology is interested in differences like that. Like, are some populations, does their diet and lifestyle affect their bones in that way? Questions like that. And there are some applied branches too, kind of like bioarchaeology. One of the applied branches is paleoanthropology. So this studies humans and our ancient human ancestors, or hominids. So if you've heard of Lucy, Australopithecus, she is someone that we're going to talk about in this class. And we're going to talk about the ancient hominids that came before her and after her. So you guys are going to be experts in that, and you'll be able to tell people all about Lucy and her life, and how tall she was and how similar or different she is to us contemporary humans today. Next, we have primatology. This is another applied branch of biological anthropology. So it focuses on non-human primates. So that means, gorillas, lemurs. These little guys are called tarsiers. I absolutely love them. Look at their eyes. They look insane. So we're going to talk about those. That's going to be a portion of this class too. And then whenever you go to the zoo, like the Columbus Zoo or whatever zoo is closest to you, you're not going to look at the monkeys and primates the same way. You're going to be like, oh my goodness, like pointing out all of these anatomies that are similar and different to us. And it's going to be fun, and you'll probably bore your friends, but it'll be exciting for you. And my favorite applied branch is forensic anthropology, and it focuses on the recovery and analysis of contemporary human remains that are relevant to medical legal systems. So this is a photo of me and my lab mate Carlos, who's also a PhD student here. He is a bioarchaeology PhD student. So that is a major that's offered at OSU, but only if that sounds interesting to you. Pursue whatever you think is interesting to you. This is just something that I enjoy. All right, so that's about it for the first portion of this lecture. I'm going to show you the glossary now. So these are all of the important terms that I talked about in this first half of the lecture. The flashcards that I provided are, all of these terms are on those flashcards, or if you prefer to study them a different way, here they are and here are their definitions. All right, so now we're going to talk about the scientific method. This should be a review from what you've already learned in previous classes or in high school, so we're going to kind of breeze through this pretty quickly. So another professor used this example, and I thought it was cute because I really like ducks. So the scientific method, how to tell if ducks like grapes. So the point of science is to kind of attempt to destroy what we know. We like to falsify things, we like to run tests, and we like to double check each other. This is kind of what separates science from other methods of generating knowledge. What we're actually doing is trying to prove a hypothesis wrong. Like, of course, like a little part of us is hoping that it won't be wrong, but by testing the hypothesis, we're giving it a chance to be wrong. And that's the scientific method, and that's why it's so transparent. So we make observations, like for example, if I saw a duck eat a grape and thought, oh my goodness, a duck ate a grape, how cute. I wonder if all ducks like grapes. I start to give more ducks grapes, and they all eat the grapes. Then that's me testing a prediction, right? If the ducks eat the grapes, then they like it. And if it eats the grape, then the hypothesis is supported. Yay! That's kind of what the scientific method is. It's really not linear though. On the previous slide, it kind of shows, observations at the top and then, a straight line down. In reality, it's more of this cycle of observing, hypothesizing, testing. Oh, that didn't work. Let's try it a different way. Okay, let's try it another way. And this is how theories are actually generated overall. So if, for example, in Columbus, the ducks really like grapes, I can't say all ducks like grapes until I test or have someone else test if ducks like grapes in Washington, in California, in Europe, So until we do those new hypotheses and run those new tests, then we can't actually make it into a theory. It's just a hypothesis that's supported. So anthropology is a scientific discipline. The scientific method is a particular way of making observations, gathering data, and testing hypotheses. There are other methods, but this is the one that we use in anthropology. So just to define the terms that I was talking about earlier, an observation is information that can be interpreted or tested. A hypothesis is a testable explanation for the observed facts. Critical thinking is what generates these hypotheses. So it's taking control of information that's presented to you and examining it. And critical thinking is something really important for academics to do, is if you're presented with information, think about it and go, no, yeah, that makes sense. Or go, I don't know about that. So it's important to do. And a hypothesis can either be supported or not supported. So the collected data from the duck experiment will either support the hypothesis or fail to support the hypothesis or refute the hypothesis. But nothing is ever actually proven. So we take these words that we use very carefully. We can't say, oh, it's proven true. can anything really be proven true, So we can test things and verify them. But that's usually as far as it goes, especially in anthropology when we're working with really complex concepts like culture and language. Most importantly, science must be traceable and transparent. So, if the scientific method isn't used in a traceable and transparent manner, then there's really no point of doing it because then no one is going to be able to verify your work. And if no one can verify your work, then you might as well have not done it at all because that's just not how science works. Traceability, meaning the ability to track documents, procedures, analyses, analysts, etc., back to their source. And transparency means demonstrate that the project is operating in an unbiased and rigorous manner. So you need to be able to write out where you gave the ducks grapes, what kind of grapes you gave them, and what kind of ducks you were feeding so that someone else can go back to that same place, park, wherever it is, with those same kind of grapes and feed the same species of duck those grapes to test exactly what you did. And they can't do that if you're not transparent and if you don't do that in a way that's traceable. Like it might be important that you got grapes from a specific grocery store because maybe you find out later that there's a recall or something like that. So being traceable and transparent is really, really important in science. Hypotheses are testable and based on observations, not facts. Hypotheses is a testable explanation for observed facts. So a fact is a verifiable and observable truth. So overall, we're saying that hypotheses aren't an educated guess, which is like kind of a quick and easy way to explain what a hypothesis is, but it's not, it's a lot more than that. It's an explanation. It's not a guess. And with enough support, a hypothesis can become a theory. So like I was saying earlier, if I find that ducks like grapes in Columbus, I can't make that into a theory until I have a bunch of other people in a bunch of other places also confirm that to be true. So if a hypothesis can't be falsified, after replicable research, then it can be accepted as a theory. And a theory is a set of supported hypotheses. So theories are not observable truths. They just haven't been falsified yet. They may always be modified or disproven in light of new evidence, often causing paradigm shifts. So a paradigm is kind of a predominant way of thinking about ideas. And this is something that we often say casually, like, oh, there was a paradigm shift and now eggs are healthy again. Like we used to think eggs were kind of like causing high cholesterol and things like that, but now recently, um, apparently eggs are good again. So that's kind of an example of a paradigm shift of a way of thinking that we had before changed, and now we have a new way of thinking about it. So here are some scientific theories that are pretty well accepted. The theory of relativity, cell theory, as in like everything is made up of cells, germ theory, that germs exist, molecular theory, plate tectonics, like the things that cause earthquakes, the theory of gravity, and evolutionary theory. So none of these can really be like quote unquote proven because we just don't have the ability to do that. But every time we test them, they always seem to hold up every time. So evolution is an observation about the natural world. We make these observations as biology changes from generation to generation. So we've observed that if we breed wolves in a specific way, we eventually end up with a pit bull or a pug or a poodle. These are observations that we've made. And a theory is what offers an explanation of this process. So evolutionary theory explains why evolution occurs, not whether it occurs or not. All right, so that was the scientific method. We breezed through that pretty quickly. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. Or there are also some pretty great YouTube videos out there, like Crash Course in the Amoeba Sisters. Those are two channels I really like. But I'm also more than happy to answer any questions too. All right, and for the final portion of our lecture today, we're going to be talking about the history of evolutionary thought. So what does that mean? Basically, it's how we've gone from not knowing about evolution at all to having the kind of robust theory of evolution that we have today, and who the major contributors are to that, like Charles Darwin. We're going to talk about him today. So I just wanted to throw out that the nature of science is hierarchical. And what I mean by that is that there's no branch of science that is independent and disconnected from other branches of science. So what that means is that everything that's true in physics is also true in chemistry. But you can't reduce chemical processes solely in terms of physics. You have to take it up a level. So this is what also is true for biology and physiology in terms of what we study in anthropology. So everything that's true in biology is also true in anthropology, but you can't reduce culture solely to biological processes, as these fields are built on hierarchical knowledge. So in forensic anthropology, I know a lot about anatomy and the skeleton, but that's just a piece of what I use to come up with a forensic anthropological practice and when I'm building a case. There are a lot more components to that than just the skeleton I'm looking at. So what we're doing in this last portion of the lecture is to look at the hierarchical nature of science, combining multiple disciplines to understand the questions that we as anthropologists are interested in. But understanding evolution in this way is actually relatively recent and only dates back to about 150 years ago. So first, the ancient Greeks believed in the concept of essentialism. Essentialism is a divine being had created a world of ideas, not physical reality, just ideas. There were ideal forms, and that what we saw as humans are just imperfect examples of those divine forms. So animals might vary, but they're just imperfect copies of that ideal form. And the ideal animal form still remained the same. Essentialism is permanent, unalterable, and eternal. So change doesn't occur. Variation isn't important. We're all just imperfect versions of these ideal forms. Then this concept of ideal forms led to the development of thought called the Great Chain of Being, pictured here. So where you go from the simplest forms of life on the bottom of the Great Chain of Being up to the most complex, and humans are at the top of that. Only superseded by a divine being or supernatural entities. So the simplest forms of life, like bacteria, or, well, I guess they didn't know about bacteria, but like an ant or an earthworm or something would be on the bottom. Humans would be on the top, and then above humans would be like a supernatural entity like angels or God. And this influenced a lot of medieval Christian theology because there was a scale of complexity and importance of beings where humans represent the apex of existence on the planet, and this was around the time we thought that we were the center of the universe. So, continuing to build from Christian theology, Archbishop James Ussher consulted the books of the Bible to calculate the actual date of creation of 4004 BCE, making the earth about 6,000 years old. So, challenging these beliefs was neither easy nor socially acceptable, because the general thought at the time was that there wasn't any need to challenge these beliefs, that they were true, and laid out in Genesis were not only the great chain of being, but also an explanation for all the variation of life in the world. Everything that exists was done exactly as it is now. Not only was that done flawlessly, but it was also done in a fixed time of 6 days. Or longer if the Bible isn't interpreted literally. But relatively soon after that, you'll see some problems arising with this system of ideas that will force people to kind of reevaluate what they know about the world. They started to find remains of animals that don't exist anymore, fossils. And if every single species on the planet has a place in this great chain of being, and if every single species has an ideal form, there would be no reason for a species to ever go extinct. Yet these fossils exist, and species have gone extinct. Then, part of the demand for this explanation was also driven by the new worlds that colonial expansion revealed. Colonial expansion brought naturalists into contact with a myriad of living things that they had never seen before through their travels, and that demanded an explanation. They were suddenly seeing plants and animals that they had never seen before, that they had never seen described before, and they wanted to know what they were and how they got there. And so all of this diversity of the floral, faunal, and human world was being revealed. Certain demands for explanation, for categorizing these different species, were beginning to be made. So how do we understand and organize and call all of these things? How do we categorize them if the great chain of being isn't really holding up right now? This is the context that starts pushing thinkers to realize that there's much more on the planet than what can be explained with current thinking. So this is the start of a paradigm shift. This resulted in the beginning of the development of the theory of evolution, which is based in 3 big main questions that had to be answered before describing a framework for how evolution occurs. And those 3 questions were, is the Earth old enough for species to change? Do species change over time? And do different species have a common origin? So now we have Carolus Linnaeus, who was alive from 1707 to 1778. He's considered to be the father of taxonomy. Taxonomy is the system of naming and classification of organisms based on morphological, and morphology is like size, shape, color, form, things like that. What something looks like is morphology. Similarities and differences. Linnaeus opposed the great chain of being, and he created binomial nomenclature that we still use today when we describe something genus first, then species second, like calling humans Homo sapiens. That's using binomial nomenclature. And we use this for plants as well. Then we have Buffon. Buffon said that the environment plays a role in how species change. So he was a rival of Linnaeus. He said that there's a dynamic relationship between organisms and their environment. He thought that biblical creation just kind of got the ball rolling, and then creatures have changed since, depending on what environment that they live in. And he also saw some things on animals that didn't really make sense to him, and he decided that they don't have a function. For example, the dew claw on a pig or a dog, like you know how some dogs have like a thumb that they like don't actually use. He saw those and thought, well, that doesn't really have a function, so this creation must not be perfect. Then we have Erasmus Darwin, who was Charles Darwin's grandfather. He coined the term speciation, speciation being the gradual change of one species to another. He believed that life was created by God and that the process of speciation produced the biological diversity that exists today. Then we have Lamarck. This guy's important. Lamarck said that organisms change to suit the environment. So he's kind of putting two and two together here based off of what Buffon was saying. He said that environmental challenges are what drive adaptations. So in this figure of these giraffes, an organism can change in order to meet an environmental challenge. So if a giraffe has a challenge in reaching like the farthest up leaves in a tree, it's going to try really hard to stretch its neck out, and then its offspring will have taller and taller necks from there, based on those the will to do that, essentially. And this kind of coined the term adaptation. Adaptation being a response to environmental challenges. But it wasn't perfect. Lamarck believed that life was kind of forever being generated. He thought that worms and such were formed by lightning strikes, and then would begin to climb up a sort of great chain of being, which is kind of a combination of the great chain of being and 18th century ideals of progress. So at any point in time, living things can come from the earth. So there were definitely flaws in his ideas. Mostly that a lot of changes that we see that are caused by the environment aren't passed down from generation to generation. For example, circumcision. This is a practice that we perform as humans, but we don't have new babies that are born that are already circumcised. Bodybuilding. If someone is a bodybuilder, then they're not going to have a really buff baby. Also, ear cropping in dogs, right? So like we do this on Dobermans, or we sometimes clip tails in breeds that have problematic tails. Their offspring don't have clipped tails and clipped ears. They still have them all the same. So these were some problems with Lamarck's ideas, and something that Darwin did fix with his new ideas, but at the time, this was the prevailing idea until Charles Darwin came around. Then we have Cuvier, who came up with catastrophism, which is like a contributor to extinction, or the concept of extinction. So he was a rival to Lamarck. He recognized that many forms of life on the planet no longer exist, and that's what he was really interested in studying. And it contributed to the idea of extinction with catastrophism. So he said that catastrophism, or the belief that great catastrophes regularly wipe out much life on the earth. He said that new forms of animals could have been created after a catastrophic event such as a biblical flood, or as we know now, a meteor killing the dinosaurs, something like that. Then we have Hutton and Lyell. They came up with the term or the idea of uniformitarianism. So basically, they observed geological processes like erosion, like plate tectonics, mountain formation. And they said that these processes happen very, very slowly. And given the slow pace of these geological processes, the Earth must be very, very old. So that's how they came up with this term uniformitarianism. It's a doctrine that geological processes operating in the present have also operated in the same way in the past and will continue to do so in the future. So overall, evolutionary thought before Darwin were that many people didn't really come up with Darwinian evolution, but they did have evolutionary ideas. So Charles Darwin didn't come up with the idea of evolution. There were lots of people thinking about this before him. Darwin didn't invent evolution, and he was not the first person to think about evolution. But he did make a huge contribution in the form of evolutionary thought. He came up with the process, the rationale that explains how species change. And a lot of people had ideas about how it occurred, but none of them really represented reality until Charles Darwin came around. So Charles Darwin coined the term natural selection, and he also worked with Alfred Russel Wallace. We can't discredit Wallace. It was Darwin and Wallace working together. So they formulated the concept of natural selection, which is one of the 4 forces of evolution that we'll talk about next week. But today, we'll just talk about natural selection. It's the process by which the better fit variants in a population become overrepresented over time. So if you look at this image here, the crows really like to eat the green beetles. And because of that, because more green beetles are eaten over time, the orange beetles have a better fit variant for the environment. And so the orange beetles are able to reproduce more and eventually become overrepresented. This is the process of natural selection. So Darwin came up with this in a 5-year journey on a ship, the HMS Beagle, and he observed natural diversity across a wide range of habitats. In general, other individuals compete with each other for resources and survival. Some individuals have more reproductive success than others, and those with more reproductive success are a good fit for their environment. So, for example, the beetles, right? The orange beetles had more reproductive success, and that's why we saw more of the beetles over time. Variants that help survival or reproduction become more frequent in the population. So if a mutation creates a variation, then unfavorable mutations would be selected against. If someone or an organism has an undesirable trait, then they are not going to reproduce as much as organisms that do have desirable traits. Today, we have a much broader base of knowledge than did Darwin, And as a result of scientific collaboration over the last 160 years, we have greatly expanded the ways in which we hypothesize about how evolution works. As you'll see in the coming chapters in the coming weeks, our knowledge of genetics, anatomy, and populations has expanded our understanding of mechanisms of evolution and have given us even better explanations of change than were offered by Darwin's original ideas. Nevertheless, Darwin and Wallace's basic ideas that heritable variation occurs in nature, that the environment poses a challenge to organisms, and that some variants do better and leave more offspring in certain environments and therefore become better represented in subsequent generations, remain invaluable gems in our quest for understanding of the natural world. Even those who supported Darwin's ideas frequently misconstrued them. So, for example, many of Darwin's contemporaries mistook natural selection for kind of goal-directed process. They thought that natural selection is kind of goal-oriented. And then they misapplied it to human political, social, and economic realities that they came to call social Darwinism. They implied that those who did better in society did so on the basis of some sort of biological superiority. Many proclaimed that society was ruled by survival of the fittest, a phrase that Darwin didn't even use until the second edition of his book. But people became prominent or wealthy due to their innate abilities, not necessarily because of socioeconomic, political, or historical processes, which we now know is the case. Many of Darwin's colleagues thought that evolution through natural selection was best seen as progress, leading to increasing complexity. They felt that human cultures that had more complex technologies and were more civilized were further along on the evolutionary ladder. Embedded in these thoughts, however, is once again the great chain of being, which is not something that we really use in evolutionary theory anymore. And when that is applied to socioeconomic and political stratification and cross-cultural technological differences, the concept of natural selection on society, in fact, provides false or incomplete explanations for the great diversity we actually see in technologies and social stratification across human societies. In fact, evolution via natural selection is neutral. It's not goal-directed. There are no higher or lower forms. Everything that's currently in existence today is equally evolved because we all made it here this long. That is, it arrived at its current form as a result of long periods of interaction by its ancestors with specific environments. An earthworm is the same as our humans, but neither would survive very long in the other's environment, if you get what I'm saying. Evolution doesn't plan for the future, and therefore does not represent progress. There has been, and unfortunately continues to be, a misconception about the relationship between the theory of evolution and the beliefs and doctrines of Judeo-Christian and Islamic religions. Religion and Darwinian evolutionary theory need not be at odds. Only if one believes that the Earth is static and organic change has not occurred is there a conflict between evolutionary fact and theory and religious belief. Most of the mainstream representatives of world religions, such as Buddhism, Christianity, Confucianism, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, Shinto, Taoism, and others, accept the fact of evolution, meaning change over time, and agree that Darwin and others' contributions have furthered human understanding over the natural world. We can debate the role of the soul and its relationship to the organic self and the uniqueness of the human spirit. But, as pointed out earlier, this is not the realm of science. Here, we keep the discussions of organic change limited to the physical realm, and we leave spiritual matters to others, just as Darwin did. All right, so that's it for this week's lecture content. I'm going to end with this glossary and one more slide. So I'm going to try and throw these at the end of every week's content. It's kind of a what next slide. So here's what you have due this week. You have to complete weekly reflection 1 by, this should say Sunday. All right, son. At 11:59 p.m. And I also gave you some optional considerations for the weekly reflection. The weekly reflection has to be at least 3 sentences or approximately 100 words in order to get full points. So look over those suggestions. They're totally optional. Feel free to write about something else instead. But that's all. You have my email, and feel free to visit my office hours if you have any questions. Thank you guys, and I'll talk to you next week.